Hi, and welcome to Ron Hasn't Seen. Today I'm kicking off a new theme of films for the month or so, and it's movies from the Great Movie Ride. For those unfamiliar, the Great Movie Ride was the marquee attraction at Disney MGM Studios, later Disney Hollywood Studios at Walt Disney World in Florida. It opened with the park in May of 1989, and it closed in August of 2017. And while the finale film had been updated with newer movies here or there, the majority of the rides stayed the same from the 1989 version. So a lot of these films that were considered classics in the original version were almost forgotten by the time it closed. For this series, I'm going through the movies that I haven't seen that had physical show elements, and maybe a couple from the original version of the montage that stood out to me after all these years. So today, I'm starting the same place the ride did with musicals and 1933's Footlight Parade. And Footlight Parade is a good place to begin, as like movies like Singing in the Rain or The Artist, it examines the transition from silent films to talkies. But unlike those, it looks at them from the perspective of exhibitors and peoples outside of Hollywood. The movie was directed by Lloyd Bacon, with Busby Berkeley doing the musical numbers. The film grossed about $2.4 million on a $700,000 budget. So it was a pretty successful movie at the time. The movie does star James Cagney as Chester Kent, a musical producer who's being put out of business by Sound Pictures. He comes up with the idea of a volume discount on musicals by creating short prologue numbers to be performed before the feature films. Joan Blondell plays his secretary Nan. She's obviously in love with him, and he's quite oblivious to it. As the movie goes on, he has to deal with nepotism from his producers, who are also scamming from him, employees stealing his ideas for rival production companies, a divorce that didn't actually go through, and a love triangle with Nan's roommate Vivian. And all this happens while he's trying to develop 3 musical numbers to impress a theater chain owner, Mr. Apollinaris. So that's the kind of the plot of the movie. The whole plot of the movie is just a framing device to get to the big musical numbers at the end. The movie did come out pre-Hays Code, so it's a little more risque than you probably would think of a film for the time. There's a lot more women in pretty revealing lingerie, some sex references, depictions of opium dens and honeymoon nights, and you're not going to see anything like this again until the 60s, and probably the MPAA ratings come in 1968, and you get things like R-rated films again. I think like most people, I haven't seen a lot of films from this era, so I really didn't know what to expect, except the elaborate musical numbers, which then don't come to the very end. Unlike a more modern musical format, which tends to be more music heavy in the first act, or first act or two, and more plot focused in the end, this reverses that because the entire plot centers around planning the big musical numbers. While this eliminated the need for suspension of disbelief of, say, a gang bursting into song and synchronous choreography like West Side Story, it left the first hour and change of the movie a bit more bland and not as timeless. I'm not saying there wasn't a compelling story, almost quite the opposite. There was a bunch of interwoven pieces of the side characters entangling Cagney's characters, as I mentioned. The producers are skimming money from him. What he thinks is his ex-wife comes back. He's in love with one woman who's just taking advantage of him, while the woman who's been taking care of him is really in love with him and he doesn't understand it. And it's a lot of this is thrown at you through really quick dialogue at a pace that would make like the Micro Machine guy envious. This makes the pace of the story a bit harder to follow, and I turned on captioning pretty quickly to follow this dialogue. In fact, I'll admit I didn't even realize he was staging live prologues and rotating them around the country, and not just deciding to film them. And that was an embarrassingly long amount of time for me to understand that. In addition to this fast talking, the acting was a bit more over the top and less natural. I do think this is more of the style at the time because the actors were just getting used to adjusting from silent films to talkies and not having to over-emote like you would on stage or in a film where you can't talk and the dialogue's not clearly heard. But it did make the story feel a bit soap opera-esque at times. But when it comes down to it, I'm not really going to recommend sitting down and watching all of Footlight Parade. What I'm going to recommend is fast-forwarding to the musical numbers at the end. Honeymoon Hotel is catchy, funny, and probably something you've heard referenced at some point. By a Waterfall is incredibly complex, including synchronized swimming, a masterful piece of production number with the girls rising up out of the water. It's really something to see, and it's something that, in the Great Movie Ride, you're introduced to right away. The third number, Shanghai Lil, that's kind of a little racist and probably skipped, honestly. Even taking its problematic nature aside, it's a disappointment compared to the other two numbers. These numbers being the huge success in the end actually kind of goes to undermine the story arc, though. It should have been clear even to 30s audiences that these numbers couldn't be produced in front of movies in a live stage. Hell, they make elaborate modern productions like Wicked or Phantom of the Opera or Les Mis look tame in their production quality. Like, you can't build a giant pool and have girls rising out of it just for a week in a movie theater. It's almost like the film wanted to reassure people that the talkie is not going to kill the old arts like stage musicals, while still trying to prove how superior the new medium was. These vaudevillian preludes and pre-shows were popular at the time, and they did exist, but they did really die just a couple years after this film, mostly due to cost, some lack of interest, and they were replaced by things like having more cartoons before the film, even though cartoons obviously existed before this, and having the cheaper movie or a serial in front of the main film. This is where we get B pictures, where you'd show a bad sci-fi or a bad western in front of your big epic, like Citizen Kane or Gone with the Wind. Maybe not those movies in particular, they're fairly long at the time, but yeah, people would spend hours at a theater seeing more than one picture. And this movie didn't know that, and it was showing what was happening kind of in the interim before we got to this. So yes, I would say watch the musical numbers. If you could find the film online, skip to about the last 20-30 minutes. The plot of the movie, I don't know if it's worth watching. It was slow. It was losing my attention by the time. Not slow. It just wasn't gripping, because I don't think they really resolve a lot of the little threads. They just kind of say, oh, okay, well, this is how we're going to get around it. So just skip to the musical numbers, watch them, and enjoy them. And realize that it's such a different type of musical, where it is clearly something staged as opposed to the cast breaking into song. And I enjoyed that, and I enjoy seeing the difference between something like that and something like the more recent West Side Story, both versions of West Side Story, or a modern musical, or even a cartoon musical. It's just something different. So yeah, watch the musical numbers and enjoy them. Well, that's it for a short episode this week. It's an old movie. I really don't have much else to say. So thank you for watching Ron Hasn't Seen. We're going to continue next week with another James Cagney film, The Public Enemy, from the gangster genre, the next scene of The Great Movie Ride. Once again, thank you guys for watching Ron Hasn't Seen. If you like this, please like the video, subscribe, comment down below. Let me know if there's any movies you think I should see that I might not have. And thanks again for watching. Have a good night.